almost indescribable how it feels to be over enemy territory with injured crew members, airplane on fire, engine on fire, and the German fighters keep plowing through us and shooting us up.
When I walked in there, all I saw were bodies. Suddenly walked in there a boy and became a man in a matter of minutes.
The largest, most destructive international conflict in history nearly tore the planet apart. In 6 years, an estimated 75 million lives were lost in World War II, more than double the death toll of any other war humanity has ever undertaken. Yet, despite the American government's staunch political opposition to Hitler's Third Reich, the United States avoided active engagement for almost half of the war. It took a surprise attack from the sky on a date which will now forever live in infamy to rouse the American army. The United States may have had the largest, most capable army in the world at the time, but the young men who enlisted knew that this would not be a walk in the park. Many were leaving their homes for the first time in their lives, and each one knew it very well may have been his last. The invasion of the beaches of Normandy is most commonly remembered as a symbol of the American war effort and ultimate triumph. But what is less often recalled are the stories of the brave men who fought the war in the sky. For Air Force pilots, performing evasive maneuvers at 20,000 feet above the ground to avoid enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire was par for the course. For the brave men in the 8th Air Force, battles were only one more thing to worry about. Every day was a matter of life and death, where the thought of never returning to their families was always present.
My name is Robert Barney. I'd like to mention I enlisted in the Army Air Corps in December 18th, 1940. I escaped twice from the Germans, both of them on the march.
I flew 68 missions, 35 in P-38s and the other half in P-51s.
I was born and raised in Philadelphia in 1923. Went to local high schools and a year and a half in college.
I worked at Lockheed. I was a riveter, and I built the Hudson bomber. We were building these for the Brits on Lend-Lease.
Because President Roosevelt had brought out the rule that we had to sign up for the draft, so I thought I could enlist and get a better assignment, which I did.
I knew I wanted to fly because in Pasadena, the P-38s were flying over Pasadena occasionally, and I would see those because they were manufactured over in Burbank area.
I signed to the Army Air Corps and went to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri for a short period of time, and then went to Laurey Field to go through armament school, Air Force Armament School, to learn about machine guns, etc. Then was transferred to the windward side of Hawaii at Bellows Field. I think it was September of 1941. And I flew as an aero gunner in an old observation aircraft as a tail gunner with a single 30 caliber machine gun.
When World War II started, America was determined to stay out of the conflict. The immense tragedies of World War I were still fresh in our memories, and with the Great Depression still taking a heavy toll on the domestic economy, engaging in the fight against Hitler was not a viable option for President Roosevelt. On December 7th, 1941, however, America was catapulted into action with a surprise attack from where it was least expected, Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor decimated the Western Navy fleet, cost over 2,000 innocent lives, and left America with no choice but to retaliate.
We had a lot of commotion, noise, like explosions. We stood there and cried like babies as we looked at our Pacific fleet laying there like that.
I was at a movie theater in Boise, Idaho,
with my parents, and a trailer came across the screen that the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor.
And when the announcement came through, everybody was upset. They couldn't believe that the Japanese, who were supposedly in conversation with the diplomats, would attack us while at the same time talking with the diplomatic corps.
I was stunned. Just amazing to have them attack us in this situation. And that day the losses were tremendous.
We were quite shocked more than anything else that it seemed to be such a surprise.
Our field, Bellows Field on the winter side of the island, was not in Pearl Harbor, but we were strafed and had airplanes shot up on the ground. At that point, I had no idea what was happening. I just know we're getting shot up by someone. We didn't know whom. My squadron commander told me to get a shoot, and off we went looking for Japanese Zeros to shoot down, and luckily we didn't find one, because with my little 30 caliber machine gun, I don't think we did much damage.
I called the plant to see if there were any instructions for me. When they heard who I was, they said, "Harry, be ready to travel Monday morning." So we're going to move many of the airplanes here, the Hudson bombers, to Arizona, Higley Field.
We did miss the Japanese because they'd gone back to their ships, and so we went back and landed at Bellows Field, and we were so bewildered. We had no idea what had happened, who they were.
Everybody said, "Let's sign up. I'm gonna go here. I'm gonna go to the Navy. I'm gonna sign up tomorrow with the Air Force." And that was the sentiment on the bus on the way back to Philadelphia. Consequently, we all went back to school. People were dropping out of class and enlisting in the various services.
I think just about everyone knows the rest after Pearl Harbor, how things turned out.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
It didn't take much convincing from Roosevelt. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, brave young men from across the country were more than willing to join the cause. In fact, despite the protests from their parents, most were itching to take up arms against the Axis powers. Bound by ties of incredible patriotism, America's young men were determined to avenge their fallen comrades.
At the urgence of my parents, they wanted me to seek a deferment. Farmers could be deferred for farming was considered an important part of the war effort.
When I went down to enlist, the line was around the block. I mean, it took several hours just to get to the window. In April of 1942, that was about 4 or 5 months after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt lowered the age from 21 to 18 for flight training. And so I enlisted in 1942 to become an aviation cadet.
When I got back to the plant, I got very concerned about my hearing. So I went to the head of the department and I said, "I need to be in final assembly." And they said, "Harry, you're winning the war. We cannot lose you. I've given you a deferment. You'll have deferments till the end of the war if you'll just stay and build these planes." So I said, "Is that your final decision?" He said, "Yes." I said, "I quit." Now I'm subject to the draft.
A few months into that deferment, patriotism got the best of my farming experience, and I rode my Harley Davidson to Boise, Idaho, to the draft board, and I asked them how soon I could be on the road into the service. They said to be back here next Tuesday at such and such an hour, and I'd be on my way, and that was fast enough for me.
After a few more months, I decided I'd try to do something besides ride a 30 caliber machine gun, an 047, and I applied for flight training in the Air Force.
They didn't call me till November, and I went to Santa Ana at a classification center. And that's where you determine whether you're going to be a pilot, co-pilot, or a bombardier.
To me, was the best place to be would be a pilot in the Army Air Corps or the Navy, either one, because I had wanted to fly, and I like to fly, and I still fly a little bit these days.
I went to Lakeland, Florida for pre-flight school, and on to Greenwood, Mississippi for basic, and Stuttgart, Arkansas for advanced flying school, and at that time got my second lieutenant's commission.
And there's where they create an ego. You must have an ego to be a soldier and be a pilot. You got to think that you can meet the enemy and beat him. By the time you get a leather jacket and a silk scarf, you're starting to walk with a swagger. And it's so important of who you are.
I became a tail gunner at age 19. From Amarillo, Texas, I went to Kingman, Arizona for gunnery training, learned how to all the mechanics of a 50 caliber machine gun. Spent about a couple of months there, and then from Kingman, Arizona, I went to Avon Park, Florida, where I met my crew, the fellows that I would be flying missions with from England over to Germany.
I went through pilot training and got my wings in May of 1943. Then went to Moses Lake, Washington, and picked up a crew of 10 after taking transition in the B-17 aircraft, which is a 4-engine bomber.
On first blush, when you see that B-17, you think, it's beyond me. But within 5 hours, you own it.
Training equipped a man with the skills necessary to survive in combat, but only true combat could teach a soldier how to win a war. And as many young soldiers, especially those fighting in the 8th Air Force, would discover, a true dogfight was often nothing like a training mission.
And started flying missions, bombing Berlin and Italy and places in Europe.
Our job was to keep the fighters away from the bombers. And if we could sight the fighters first, we would attack them before they could hit the bombers.
The CO calls me in the beginning, and his name is Looper. And he said, I've been looking at your past, your background. He said, I like what I see. He said, I think I'd like you to be a lead crew. And he said, let me tell you what you get if you become a lead crew. On your 6th mission, I'll give you your 1st lieutenancy. And on your 16th, I'll give you your captaincy. And then after 25 missions, if you'll sign up for another tour, I'll give you a majority and you won't have to fly. How's that sound? I said, oh, that sounds fine. So I started that program. To be a lead crew, there's so much practicing. Whenever the mission doesn't fly, they give you a practice mission. So you're absolutely starved for life or sleep. Crew was just kind of a mishmash of mother's boys and awfully young kids. Now, I'm not that much older than they are at that time. I'm 23. But I've got the responsibility of taking care of all these guys.
I shot one Messerschmitt 109. He just got in my way, and I happened to pull the trigger, and it happened to hit him. It was more luck than accuracy.
I found that to be a very exciting endeavor because every time we went out, we were shot up pretty good by either German fighters or German flak. Their flak guns could reach us at about any altitude, and they had a lot of them spread around Germany. So we had some pretty good air battles there. We shot down a lot of German fighters, and they shot down a lot of our planes.
Can indicate how stupid mistakes can almost kill you in some of these missions. In one in particular, in a P-51, we had gun heaters on the guns to heat the guns. Because up there it's 65 degrees below zero up there. And that's cold. If you touch your bare hand onto the airplane aluminum, you'd probably lose your hand. It would just freeze it there. But anyway, I forgot to turn the gun heaters on at low altitude. But so when I got up to altitude, we got into a dogfight, and my guns had all frozen up because I hadn't turned on that gun heater. And they were chasing me, and I couldn't do anything but try to get away. I couldn't shoot back because my guns were all frozen. And one of my squadron mates, he shot one off my tail, so that way we finally got home.
Our targets was oil refineries, railroad marshaling yards, ball bearing plants, aircraft manufacturing plants, bridges.
Well, we did, in the P-38, we did escort missions, and we did strafing missions where we did dive bombing of bridges and railroad yards and that type of thing. And then when we got the P-51s, why, we basically were assigned to escorting bombers.
And on my ninth mission, we were going to bomb a town called Cottbus, Germany, which was about 70 to 80 miles east-southeast of Berlin. And
then mid-air collisions were not uncommon there. The English weather was such that there'd be 1,000 bombers forming up over England and maybe 600 or 700 fighters forming up. We're all trying to get in the air at the same time. And then many times you'd break out of a cloud and I'd be looking right on the belly of a B-17, maybe 10 feet above me. So I'd have to dive back into the clouds to get away from them and hope I didn't hit anybody going down.
Unfortunately, training and expertise were often not enough. Fighting while airborne in Germany was, on a good day, a matter of both skill and luck. For even the most skilled pilot, the possibility of any of 1,000 errors or accidents was never far away, and even one could send a plane spiraling out of the sky. And for many young men, being shot down was only the beginning of their journey.
We were losing 60 airplanes a day from the 8th Air Force. Now that's a lot of planes. It's 60 men also. There's 10 in each plane.
Our target for that day was at an oil refinery at Luskendorf, Germany. And about 10 minutes before target time, we were encountering a lot of aircraft, 88 millimeter shells that were blowing up in the sky. The Germans were shooting at us.
I was shot down on my 18th mission on a mission to Berlin, and I was hit by a German flak. It knocked out of formation, and the German fighters ganged up on us and shot us up pretty good.
Another B-17 in our squadron got hit and came down upon our aircraft, and the propeller severed the tail off. So I'm separate from the rest of the crew. I didn't know that at the time because I immediately become unconscious.
We had the assignment to feint toward Berlin, skirt the anti-aircraft ring of fire, and drop down to 10,500 feet. At that altitude, the anti-aircraft fire became quite intense, and we had to open up our formation.
And finally, my navigator said, "Harry, look over here to the left." And I look over to the left, and we're on a collision course with another group of planes, what they call shuffling the deck. They went up and over, and I went under. And just at that moment, the upper turret gun was firing, and I'd never heard it fire before. It's right behind the pilot. And I looked off to the left, and I could see a 190, Focke-Wulf 190, was pumping 20 millimeter shells right through the window into the instrument panel, just tearing it up. And I thought, I'm not getting hit, but I knew that the war was over for me. And I thought, it's strange that I'm not getting hit. And then suddenly the plane went into a vertical climb. We won't go up very far, stalled out, did a hammerhead. Fire broke out in the cockpit. My co-pilot got up to go down, and he just melted there. And I sat there and I reflected, gosh, here I am, just all this training, 7 missions, and it's over.
On the last black shot, here comes the Messerschmitts, and they shot our plane, and they raked it from the nose and top turret, and the 2 engines, between the 2 engines on the right wing.
And German fighters were just terrific. I mean, those guys, I have a lot of respect for them. They, I like the way they would queue up. When you're flying a large group, they find maybe we got 1,000 bombers in the air. They find a group that's got the loosest formation, and they would fly with the same heading you are, maybe a couple thousand feet higher, and they get maybe a mile and a half or a couple of miles ahead, and they split S, as we call it, turn upside down and go right through the formation head on. And then when they did that, chances are we'd get them, but they'd always get a bomber. So, you know, we had so many bombers going over there to hit them with 1,000 bombers or up to 1,500 bombers on one mission. That we finally killed them with numbers. That we had to kill them in numbers.
Every mission was a challenge in itself, because you're taking off maybe 1,000 gallons of gas in that airplane and bomb loads, and just to get off the ground was a miracle with them. But on one particular mission, October 30th of 1944 is Halloween, the day before Halloween. We were to pick up some bombers coming off the target in Hanover, Germany. And we were in P-51s this time. And so we were about 30,000 feet, and our job was to find the bombers coming off of the target. The weather was bad, and we never did find the bombers. And as the weather got worse, the leader said, well, let's try to go through this. And we were maybe at 25, 28,000 feet at that time. And when he started through it, we all closed in on one another and flew in formation, almost wingtip to wingtip, and you fly off of the leader. And we got into this stuff, and then that's the last I saw of the 3. There were 3 other fellows besides me. There was 4 in the flight. And the first thing I knew something was wrong, I was in like in a bottle of milk. You couldn't see anything. It was in a big cloud bank. And then I looked down, it didn't look down. My cords were hanging in my face, my oxygen cord and my radio cord, and I knew I was upside down. And I watched my wing tanks roll off the end of my wings, but you don't know that. You have no horizon. You don't know where. You have no orientation anymore, and vertigo sets in. And the updraft would catch us and shoot us straight up in the air, and then the downdraft would get us, and we'd be going straight down. And when my speedometer would reach maybe 450, 500 miles an hour, I knew I was going straight down. I had no horizon, so I didn't know. And I'd get the stick and pull it back, and airspeed would fall off, and the altimeter would start to climb, and I must be going up. And so that's what we did, up and down in that darn cloud bank. And finally I recovered at about 500-600 feet off the deck in Germany. And the other 3 pilots all went down in that mission. And the Germans never fired a shot at us. It was all the weather that took us down.
In my case, I lost my controls. All I had left was rudder. Didn't have elevator and didn't have aileron, so I'm trying to fly the aircraft with rudder. And the German fighters keep plowing through us and shooting us up.
I had lost the 2 engines on the right side of the wing, and came into a spiral which was ever tightening, which would then eventually be in a tight spin, which you would never get out of.
So I had no choice left but to bail the crew out.
You see, we're strapped in, so I'm not going anywhere. But think of the guys that are standing in the waist gun or the radio operator at his desk. Any place that's not strapped in, when the plane is in this kind of a maneuver, they just get wrecked, they get injured, killed. That's why nobody survived.
Fumes are there remaining. And when you get hit with an armor-piercing incendiary bullet from the German plane, you will normally explode, and we did explode.
I had no control over anything. There was a little door for tail gunners to bail out. But I was immediately unconscious and could not. Centrifugal force had me pinned into where I couldn't move.
I ordered bailout, and we found that my navigator and my top turret gunner were dead from the fire of the Messerschmitt.
So ultimately, it did flip me out. I don't know how, why, or anything like that, but it did flip me out through the newly created hole where the tail was severed.
In the event of disaster, Air Force pilots were all trained to bail out of their plane. The goal was to save as much of the crew as possible, but at speeds of over 700 kilometers per hour, a mid-air bailout was one of the most dangerous maneuvers a pilot would ever have to attempt.
Fortunately, we got the whole crew out except my radio operator. He's the only one that was killed in the air. But just about everyone got injured a little bit, but all in all, I think we were pretty lucky.
I really didn't know what happened to the rest of my crew, or I didn't even think about it, really. I was concerned about myself at the time.
My primary bailout was a Bombay, but I couldn't get back there because the top turret was twisted up and from enemy gunfire and that type thing. So I bailed out of the nose hatch, which is pretty small, but I was a pretty skinny little guy then.
On my way out, I must have hit the Bombay door, became semi-unconscious, I guess, and do not remember pulling a ripcord for my parachute.
Because we had been briefed pretty well by people that experienced in parachuting, that it's a good idea for a lot of reasons to delay opening your chute. So what I did was I pulled a ripcord and held on to it. And when I bailed out, because I didn't have the arms to guide me, and it gave me an airfoil of sorts, and I just spun like a top. So what I would do, would hold my chute with my right hand, put my left hand would stop, just almost immediately stop spinning. Just that, because you're flying maybe 120 miles an hour, you're maybe falling at speed. And then we spin everything, switch hands and so forth.
Just a few thousand feet above the earth, I decided, well, I awakened, I decided, well, maybe I better figure out how I'm going to land.
When I saw the ground moving toward me, I just dropped my arms and chute opened, and I floated on down to safety. When my chute opened, I found that my arms were pinned above my head. I said to myself, there's something wrong here. And there definitely was something wrong, because I looked down like so, and I could see my leg straps flapping in the wind. And I thought, oh my God, my chest strap had caught on my Mae West, and they're both hung up under my chin. And it was freaky that I didn't slip clear out of the harness.
So when I awakened, I was disoriented, and I was up on the windshield of the instrument panel, and I tried to kick open the window, but the window lock was on. When I got to the window lock, the plane was gone. I was now just in a piece of it. The whole thing had just come apart. Seats were gone. Upper turret ring was there, So I just rolled out with my backpack, lit in a tree. My face got burned, but the shroud and the silk just caught on the limbs, and I had a landing without incident, just very, very gentle.
As I woke up, I looked down and I'm coming into some trees. So we had been taught to cross our legs so as not to get hung up in the branches of the trees. And went down through the branches and so forth, but the parachute hung up in the top of the tree. So I'm dangling about 15 feet from the ground, and the only thing you can do is open the shrouds of your chute and drop to the ground, and at that point I injured my left ankle.
Luckily, I did land properly. I landed with my back to the wind and slammed me down pretty good. Dragged me a little ways.
When I landed, I couldn't guide myself at all, and I hit heel first and it knocked me out.
Safely landing was only half of the battle. Survivors of planes shot down in Germany now found themselves deep in enemy territory. Even German civilians were often hostile towards American soldiers, and in the dead of winter, the long trek to the Allied front lines was almost a suicide mission.
This was in German territory, and then I started worrying about what the reception would be with the Germans.
Got out my maps and stuff, and they were the wrong maps. They were southern France instead of Germany. So I started going north to go to Sweden, and I probably ran for about 2 hours. Finally, I got so tired, I just laid down.
I decided to come out and start walking northbound.
When I landed at Magdeburg, I was picked up by civilians, and they weren't too happy to see American Terrorflieger, as they called us, bomber pilots, and they beat me up pretty good on the ground.
And pretty soon, I looked up and 2 kids were standing there, about 10 years old. And they were so friendly, I thought they were going to help me. So they took me into town, into a little village, like a Hansel and Gretel village. And I was still so tired, I kept sitting down. And pretty soon, maybe 20, 25 people came. And I'm in the center there. And then when they discover who I am, that I'm a pilot, 8th Air Force, they start kicking me. Well, it got extremely dangerous. They were going to kill me.
So I peered up and looked. I saw people heading in my direction, and they were shouting at me. I started to run away from them at first. I started running the opposite direction. When they started shooting at me, I decided, well, I better do something else. I had slammed my body down to the earth, and I started peering up again. The people just kept coming towards me, so I just ended up putting my hands in the air and walking towards them. I surrendered. They encircled me, German civilians. Some had guns, some had the implements, farm implements, forks, shovels. I couldn't understand anything they were saying except for 2 words. There was 2 words I understood. Chicago gangster. Hitler had put out in his propaganda, the media, radio, whatever, that all Air Force people were recruited in Chicago, and they were all former gangsters.
And I got lucky. A neighborhood lady took me in her house, and she seemed to dominate the neighborhood. After a few minutes, I found out she helped me. I think the reason she helped me is because she had a son that was a POW in the United States at New Mexico. But that was a big break for me because A lot of the people got killed that day that was on that same mission. And it was a lot of people that I knew were killed when they landed.
Fortunately, there was a guy there with a gun, an old man from the Wehrmacht, and he fired the gun into the air and then came and pointed it at them, said, "Leave him alone." And as it turned out, he had two sons, one on the Eastern Front and one on the Western Front. And he walked me to a Luftwaffe base.
Anyway, I was hoping this lady would call the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, to turn me in, but she didn't. She called the civilian police, and that scared the hell out of them because the civilians is who you certainly the ones you don't want to get taken prisoner by, because there's a good chance that they would kill you.
They made me disrobe all my clothing off, down to my long underwear. They shredded the fleece-lined suit, the electric flying suit, and I was allowed to put on the bare necessities. I determined by their motions that they wanted me to go to a nearby village, me leading the way and them following me, and frequently why I was kicked in the rear and spat upon. One fellow pulled his gun down, was going to shoot me, and another fellow hit his arm, and the bullet rifled up into the sky. They took me to this nearby village and put me in a garage.
I was apprehended by a forest ranger who had a rifle with a scope that could have followed me for 50 miles. And as a result, he said, "Hands up," and I did. And at this point in time, I'm aching pretty bad. My leg is hurting. And I decided I didn't care whether they caught me or not.
I felt pretty lucky to be eventually turned over to the Luftwaffe.
Naturally, I was very scared, thinking that probably hanging was my future. After a couple of hours, the door opened, and there was a German policeman there. He motioned for me to come out and to walk on a dirt road that led past through the village. He was riding his bicycle, and I was walking. We gradually overtook a farmer with a wagon pulled by a bull. The German policeman ended up, after some conversation with the farmer, he ended up riding the hay wagon, and I pushed his bicycle on into the little town of Eisenberg.
Once captured by the Germans, an American pilot was officially a prisoner of war. While the Geneva Convention did offer them some protection from torture or execution, enhanced interrogation was a common experience. The Germans tried to extract any information they could from their prisoners, and they were very efficient.
When we got to Eisenberg, I was taken into the police station and shoved into this cell. The German guard left, and just a few minutes after he left, I started getting alarmed because there was a lot of prying on my door. People were trying to get the hinges off, get the door open or something, and I thought, well, they're trying to get me out and hang me. I thought that was my thinking.
They transported me to the interrogation for all officers at the Frankfurt on the Oder.
I don't think I got very much sleep that night. I'm sure I didn't. The next morning, I was taken down to headquarters and was shown scorched parts of my aircraft, like oxygen masks, not oxygen masks, oxygen containers, and scorched dog tags or identification tags from some of my crewmen. And they wanted me to identify these. I decided at that time I might be the only survivor of this incident.
When we're walking along, this old guy kept saying, "For you, the war is over." And he was actually joyous. Not everybody embraced the war, particularly an old guy like this. Thought Hitler was a madman. And when we parted, we actually had simpatico and we embraced. And he wished me well. I didn't understand German, he didn't understand English, but we understood each other.
We ultimately came to a place near Frankfurt, Germany called Oberursel.
We had to detrain, walk maybe 100 yards through rubble, get into the station proper. And there was a gal there serving potato soup. And I hadn't eaten for a couple of days. And she came over and offered me this soup. And I said, yeah, I'd take one. So I wolfed it down and she said, would you like another? And the kindness, it got to me. I started crying. And she took me in her arms and acted almost like a mother. It was just the most wonderful experience where the enemy holds you. And I had two occasions, the old man and this woman. It just hard to explain it all.
There, after a day in a little cell with some sort of soup, they let me into an interrogator.
And we had heard about this place in training in the United States as being an interrogation center where all prisoners of war had to go through this camp and be interrogated almost daily. I was there for 9 days.
The British had briefed us that don't be surprised at anything the German intelligence knows about you, because they have the best intelligence in the world. And I found out later that what that said was certainly true.
Everybody would be placed in isolation, small cells, and the Germans would try to extract information from you.
The one thing that he was trying to find out, where was the 10th man of the crew. They had accounted, after picking up the rest of the crew, they wanted to know where was the 10th man. What happened? We were only flying with 9 men that day, 1 waist gunner short. And I guess it drove them nuts that they would have a airman roaming around Germany that they couldn't account for.
They could speak very good English. Some of the things they wanted to know, as I remember, was where you were stationed in England, what your target was for that day, what kind of a plane were you flying in, and a lot of different things that actually a tail gunner would not have any answers for at all.
Several times they asked me lots of questions, and I would say, I can't give you anything but name, rank, and serial number. And that made them pretty unhappy, and they would do things to aggravate me, like turn up the heat in my room and stuff like that.
And our argument was that we didn't know anything more, and under the Geneva Convention, that's all we were entitled to have to give him.
When brutality did not yield the answers they wanted, German soldiers often tried more creative tactics.
The Germans offered me more food if I divulged more information. And I almost caved in because I was getting quite hungry at that time.
They finally brought me in and offered me a drink of wine, and I wouldn't take it because I know I've got a loose tongue when I have a few drinks.
About the 7th day in this small cell, the interrogator came in. He carried a large folder. He had the answers to everything that he had asked me. So actually he was wasting my time and I was wasting his.
He never did get anything out of me other than I was with Looper. There's nothing they can do with the information while you don't know anything. It's just a game they play.
When I told him the last time, I said, I can give you all the name, rank, and serial number. he started in, he told me things about myself that I'd forgotten. He told me where I went to high school, told me what sports I participated in, where my aircraft was parked in England, and all kinds of things. And I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe what I was hearing.
And there was 3 or 4 young German soldiers in there. One of them could speak English pretty good. He started asking me questions that didn't have anything to do with warfare. Some of them were Adolf Hitler's picture, a painting of Adolf was up on the wall, and I had glanced up there. This fellow noticed this. He said, do you know who that is? I said, yes. What is your opinion of him? Well, realizing my perilous situation, I didn't have any opinion at all. Then they started grilling me about cowboys and Indians, Hollywood. From there, I was taken to my first prison camp at Wetzlar, Germany.
I was transported to Stalag Luft 3, which was near the old Czechoslovakian border.
Stalag Luft III was probably the most famous of all the German prison camps, as immortalized in the classic film, The Great Escape. Over 11,000 Allied men were held in the camp between 1942 and 1945. For them, the war was over, but their troubles were only just beginning. As a prisoner of war, a soldier was afforded the luxury of knowing that he was relatively safe from harm. However, that did not mean the conditions were ideal. In fact, for some, life in the prison camps was worse than it was in combat.
It was called a transitional camp, and I was only there for about probably 3 weeks. That was my first introduction really to prisoner of war life, and you met lots of people, other prisoners in this camp that were had stories. Everyone had a story to tell.
In that camp, they had separated the Brits from the Americans because more Americans were getting shot down.
We had 5 compounds, which is about 10,000 officers in that same camp.
We had 10,000 prisoners, all officers. Nobody had to work. If there was any work to be done, it was done by the Russians. And they slept on the ground, and we slept in barracks. There was 2,500 to a barracks.
First part of my capture was summertime, and walking around the camp, there was some recreational footballs, basketballs, and baseballs.
We had fellowship, we had German classes, we had salesmanship classes. We didn't figure the war was going to last 2 weeks. This won't be a big problem. But it went on 9 months.
Some of the things I probably will never forget was the condition that some of the prisoners were in there. Some of them had been in very devastating incidents and whatnot. I remember this one P-38 pilot that didn't get out of his P-38 quick enough, and he was scorched. His face and hands were, his ears were gone, and he looked pretty sad.
The first duty that I was assigned was to dig out tree stumps because we knew that the Germans were short on fuel, and actually the allotment of fuel for cooking and for heat was like 1 briquette per day per prisoner. So that would keep the home fire going too long. A briquette, by the way, is compressed coal. So we supplemented that by digging out the tree stumps, cutting them up, and stockpiling them to the fuel supply. Got very cold, and what do you do when it's cold? You find every bit of clothing you have and every blanket you can find, and sit in the bunk and shiver. The only time you really got out of your bunks was number one, the first thing the Germans did in the morning was roll call. And the last thing in the afternoon was roll call.
I found myself feeling sorry for myself and walking the fences, and we didn't have to work, a lot of idle time, and so it was frustrating. I was wondering why I was there, or why. In a way, I was also wondering about my buddies that I worked with for 6 months or so, why they had to die and I'm still alive. I always had that on my mind also.
I got down to 115 pounds. I normally weigh 165. My upper arm was the same size as my wrist. So you can see we really lost a lot of weight. We'd look at each other and we could count all the ribs.
We lived on the grace of the American Red Cross through the Swiss Red Cross distributing some food parcels.
Red Cross parcels were delivered to warehouses near the prison camp. And we would get a Red Cross parcel occasionally, one parcel for 2 men. There was different products in Red Cross parcel. I remember powdered milk, cheese, meat, soap, cigarettes were some of the items in there. After a couple of weeks there, maybe 3, I started hearing the Allies' guns, artillery and whatnot again. And we all kind of imagined that the Germans would let us go and that we'd be overtaken by the Allies. This didn't happen.
In the dead of winter, moving from one prison camp to another was not an easy task. Soldiers had to walk tens of thousands of miles through the snow in below zero weather, and the marching was always done at night. For many prisoners, the transfer order was a death sentence.
Early 1945, the word came down from Adolf Hitler to march us out.
The Russians were making an attack from the east, and their target was Breslau. And having been not too far from Breslau in this camp, they decided they would have to move us under the terms of the Geneva Convention out of the line of fire.
That was in February. Himmler had instructed our CO, the German CO, a major, that had been an instructor in Santa Barbara, to kill the prisoners. And that's when they stopped the food. And we felt that we were mostly bedridden by that time. We felt they were going to burn the camps. But our CO, who was Zemke, knew of this instructions. And this German major told Himmler, come and do it yourself. He wasn't going to do it. So that was kind of an iffy situation.
We had to evacuate it was at late in the evening, and it was a blizzard.
At midnight on the 26th of January, they pulled us out of the barracks, half foot of snow, 30 below with the wind chill.
And they gave us 30 minutes to fall out. We fell out in the blizzard and stood there for a long time before one day I said to myself that I can't hang around here too long because it's something I hadn't mentioned. I had a infested toe from an ingrown toenail, and I said, I can't survive a march, so I'm going to step out of line and hope I can make it, because I figured I'd rather be shot than die on the march in a blizzard.
We spent that night walking or marching, whatever you want to call it, through dawn. And when dawn came, we spent the first night in the ditches on the side of the road because we would not march at the daylight due to the possibility of being shot by our own Air Force.
Even for those prisoners lucky enough to be transferred via train, conditions were dismal, all without the knowledge of an eventual destination.
One particular day, we were all taken from the camp to the train station, Wetzlar, and we all boarded boxcars.
Designed for 45 soldiers, and we had about 75 in there.
So you were sitting body to body, 2 guards per car. There was one large door with 2 guards in attendance at the door, 1 on each side, with their arms, of course. We took off. We didn't know where we were going.
The temperature during this period of time, I believe, was below 0 at all times.
And we started down the railroad track, scared to death when it wasn't going to happen to us. We didn't know where we were going to the concentration camp or what was going to happen. Were they going to take us someplace and shoot us, or what was going on? The
train was very slow en route. It was one of those old coal burners, steam engine. Oftentimes it would pull into a wooded area because Allies were looking for trains, and it had been known that oftentimes they would strafe trains. It was only about 120 miles or something like that. It took several days for us to get there.
I had an very infected foot there that was had that operation, and I had to standing room only. So I tied my blanket to the sort of a little rafter inside the boxcar, would hang on because there's some pretty sick people that had to lie down, and we tried to make room for all we could.
They allowed us to sit on the floor, but the guy in front of you would sit in your lap area, spread your legs out, and the guy behind you would do the same thing.
But we had people die just on that long trip because we were on the boxcar about a week.
Our destination proved to be Nuremberg, Germany.
Now, the camp in Nuremberg was an abandoned Polish work camp.
The camp at Nuremberg was originally left to rot after larger camps were built to house Polish prisoners. But after Operation Barbarossa, the massive influx of Russian prisoners necessitated its reopening. Soon, American prisoners were sent as well. The camp was never remodeled to accommodate the larger numbers.
It was sort of a hellhole. It was a pretty bad place. When we finally got unloaded there and marched in, we found our group from our compound at Stalag 3, which is our main camp. And I was lucky I hooked onto that group and was with them for several weeks.
At Nuremberg, I was in a barracks. The barracks were very crude, of course. They had probably been utilized for other reasons before they made a prison camp out of it. My bed was the floor. I didn't have a regular bunk or anything. My bed was the floor, and we were always a little cold and hungry. We did find out that some of the prisoners that had been there for many years, some of the English and French prisoners, had garnered enough parts to a radio, and they made a radio. The Germans never did find out about this radio. They listened to BBC every evening. And the news would be passed around ear to ear about how the Allies were doing. This news was one thing that really kept us going, because we knew that the Allies were really forced them, and And of course, the German version of news was a lot different than what we were hearing. They were always winning and telling about how many Americans were killed and things like that.
As many prisoners would find out, German guards were only one of the dangers to life as a POW. Allied fire could be just as dangerous.
One night, the British Pathfinders came in and dropped flares around the marshal yards. And the English Lancasters came in one at a time and started to drop bombs in the marshal yards. There was no severe damage to us in the work camp.
You were afraid of your own Air Force. I remember in Nuremberg, 2 different times when I was there, the English bombed the city of Nuremberg, which was, the prison camp was just on the outskirts of Nuremberg. They bombed it at night, and it was everybody was being very religious and pulling blankets over their head and laying on the floor, figuring that if one of those bombs would land in the camp, that would be it, you know.
However, the next morning, the 8th Air Force contingent came in and dropped a pretty heavy concentration of bombs, and they caught an ammunition train, which I guess was the target to begin with, in the marshal yards. And this ammunition train exploded. Our barracks that we were in went sideways from the explosion, and we were actually looking up at clear blue sky.
After a couple of weeks there, we started hearing the Allies' artillery again, and we hoped again that we would, Germans would let us go. No such luck.
So as a result, they had to move us to a further camp, which was called Mooseburg.
The more a prisoner was put through, the greater the desire to escape often became. Many men, indeed, found transfers to be the perfect opportunity for this, as the marches were sparsely guarded. But the question remained, was trekking through the German countryside alone worth the risk? Was it any safer than remaining a prisoner?
10,000 prisoners, I found out later, were on this march from Nuremberg to Mooseburg, kind of close to Munich.
We left there about noon one day, and we got hit that afternoon when we were marching. We got hit by American fighters. They strafed us because they really obviously didn't know that we were Americans.
We call it a march, but it didn't even resemble a march because guys were strung out so bad, and some of them had injuries and whatnot. They had a hard time keeping up with the group.
It was like a rowdy bunch of people walking along. There was no discipline in that, except for one time when we were under the control of the SS. And they had some Hitler Jungen, young German kids, 14, 15, 16. And they were our guards for a contingent period of time there. And that was a little different. They towed the mark and shot a couple people. A disturbance on the road took place, and we all tried to hit the ditches to keep away from this runaway team of horses.
It killed a few guys, injured some fellows, not too far from my position on the march. There was some false alarms after that, because we were all so jumpy and nervous, you know. Somebody, after they reformed our columns and took off again, somebody screamed attack, and guys just took off every direction, any direction. I came to my particular group was in the area of a small city, rural city. I took off across the yard and through the backyard and came to a chicken coop. I didn't have time to try to find out where the gate was. I put my head down and busted into the wire fence, and it almost knocked me unconscious. Actually, it was a false alarm, so we were all garnered together again and proceeded on our way.
I didn't know where we were going. I didn't know what was going to happen, and I decided I'd try to escape, and which is no big deal because you march at night, and the German guards were scarce. They had dogs that were tired, German shepherds that were exhausted, and so I decided that I would try to escape. And as it turned out, I saw my co-pilot that I had seen in several weeks sitting by a tree, and his name is Tex Baldy, and I walked up to Tex and greeted him and said, "Tex, would you like to try to escape?" And he said, "Yes." So that night, we did escape. No big deal.
We were instructed not to make any effort to escape if we were shot down.
We knew that the war was just going to be over very shortly, and you were weighing one thing against another, and most of the prisoners felt like that it was better to stay with the group and be liberated as a group rather than strike out on your own.
We did not attempt to escape due to the fact that you are so far in Germany that you did not, it was too far to try and get to the front lines.
Those who did escape gained their freedom at a high risk. Most were so off course from their original destinations that any maps they owned were useless. The German landscape was vast, and without being able to speak the language, any civilian was a potential enemy. Indeed, Adolf Hitler personally ordered the execution of 50 POWs who were caught in the attempt to escape Stalag Luft III.
There are thousands of people marching down the road, and you see a German car coming towards you with the hoods on the lights. They blind you, but they can't see them from above. And so I told Tex, I said, well, there's woods. We're marching alongside the woods, and when a car comes by that looks like blinds us a little bit, I'll tug your coat and we'll take off for the woods, which we did. Car was coming with the lights on. I grabbed Tech's coat and pulled on it, and here we went. We went over the banks of a canal and into the canal, waist deep, holding our blankets above our head, until thousands of people marched by. We were just standing there scared to death and halfway frozen. But eventually everyone passed by, and we were still there. We're still free. And but now what do? We got no compass. We got no maps. We don't know the area. But we thought we were free, which is of course a little bit ridiculous.
Some nights we slept under the stars. We didn't get to places where we would have a cover. I do recall spending one night in church. There was prisoners on the floor, under the pew, on the pews.
We slept one night in a barn. We sneaked into a German barn and slept there. The second day out, we were trying to skirt a little village, and we couldn't figure out how to get by without them seeing us because there were some French workers in the field. And we tried to go between the French workers and the city in a little town. And we got about halfway by the town, and some old man, he was older than me then, he was probably 50. He came running out, and he said, hollered at us like who are we, and all that. I tried to tell him we were Frenchmen, and he spit out a few words of French, and I told him nix for staying. He wasn't even impressed with my German. He let out a big holler, which meant he's letting the town know that he's got, someone suspicious. And I told Tex, I said, we got to make the woods, which is up a hill, and I put my foot behind him and pushed him. He fell, and we started up the hill. We got about halfway up there. It dawned on me that so we find the woods. What happens then? Because the German woods and forests, they're no different than parks, perfect parks in the United States. I mean, the woods are always so clean. But it didn't matter because the old man let out a scream, and the whole town was after us, and they caught us before we got to the woods. I was pretty well scared at that point, and so was Tex. But they took us down to the Burgermeister's office, which is in German is mayor, and they stood us in front of the Burgermeister in his office, and he's a little fat German. He's looked like the movies, like he should be a German mayor in a war or something. But we stood there maybe an hour, and he'd look at us and shake his head and talk on the telephone. And lo and behold, we're standing there after about an hour or so. This big guy must have been about 6'5", 6'6", little beetle-browed guy walked through with his rifle and walked into the next room, and Tex and I could hear him cocking his rifle. And I told Tex out of the corner of my mouth, I says, "We're dead, Tex." He says, "Yeah, I know." The first 100 yards or so was terrorizing because we thought maybe we'd get a bullet in our head. It turned out we marched and maybe walked maybe 3 kilometers. And we looked ahead, and in the barnyard there was a bunch of soldiers. As we got closer, we recognized them being American POWs. We didn't know them personally, but it's a group that marched all the way from Posen in Poland, and had been captives for a long time.
We marched at night sometimes. I remember one night we marched all night long, and you couldn't hardly see the prisoner in front of you. You would put your hands on his shoulder so you knew where to go, and the guy behind you would do the same thing. We didn't know what our destination would be on this trip. It took about 12 days to do it. Our destination on this trip was a place called Moosburg, Germany. One of the largest prison camps in Germany.
Moosburg, the final destination for many Allied prisoners, was a massive establishment deep in the heart of German territory. While some prisoners may have recognized this move as part of a systematic retreat, most others were unaware. For them, the journey seemed endless. Misguided by German misinformation, most were unsure if they would ever make it home.
76,000 prisoners of all sizes, shapes, and forms, and there was Russians there, there was Polish there, everybody in free French, and of course Brits and Americans.
So they tagged us on with this group, and we was with them a few days, and it was kind of tough because he had a tech sergeant in charge. It was a pretty hideous guy and overbearing with us, but we, in one particular case, we fell out. We'd go to a German bar and sleep, and then we'd fall out the next morning, and they'd count, and they counted. They came up short one man, and this German tech sergeant walked back in the barn, took a pitchfork and went to work punching in the hay, and we let out a scream, and we knew that he'd got his man. And we marched out of there, and he left us a guy with full of pitchfork holes, left it for the German farmer to take care of. Anyway, make a long story short, we escaped. We decided after 2 or 3 more days we'd try another escape, and we did that by when we were sleeping in a barn. We looked around and found out they had a tool room where they kept the plows and that type thing, and it was adjacent to the barn we're sleeping in. And I told Tex we'd try to make it that that night, if we could do it, we'd try it anyway. And so we covered up in the hay and laid there for a couple of hours till it was so quiet you couldn't believe it. And I knew that everyone must be asleep. And I tugged on Tex, and we crawled out of there and crawled through the tool shed and over a wooden fence. We had to walk through the barnyard. We walked very slowly. I was scared to death. Went over the fence and walked about probably a quarter of a mile from the direction that we would come in, and spread our blankets under a tree and went to sleep. So we were escapees again, and we felt pretty lucky about that.
The Russian prisoners were a sad lot, I thought. We did receive Red Cross parcel while we were there, in addition to the German black bread and a bowl of soup occasionally. But the Russians never received any Red Cross parcels. They were walking skeletons. They didn't look like they would last another day or two. They looked so pitiful.
There were some original barracks there, but they were all taken up long before we got there. But this was just nothing but a big barbed wire pen. Had to be at least a half-mile square, and as the prisoners were coming in, no room in any of the barracks or that. We just went out and slept on the ground under the stars.
But luckily, the worst was finally over for these heroes. World War II was coming to a close, and with that, freedom was imminent.
We kept our eyes open for what looked like a good place to rest and sleep. And we saw this one place. It was quiet, didn't have any chickens, didn't have any barking dogs, and a very quiet-looking place, neat-looking place. And I looked at Tex and I says, "Are you thinking the same thing I am?" And he said, "Yes." So we very quietly marched up to the front door, which is about maybe 200 feet. And I stood by the door. I told Tex to knock on the door, and I stood out about 3 or 4 feet away. And a lady came to the front door, an elderly lady, and she looked at us and looked scared, but not terrified. And I said real quick, I said, "Ich kriege Gefangenen," which just tells her we're prisoners. And that seemed to relax her a little bit. And but then her husband, the old man, came to the door, and God, he seemed to be tickled to death to see us. And he said, come and see. So we went in, and he says, "Come on." He wanted us to go to his basement with him. And a situation like that sounds terrifying, but we knew better than that at that point. You know, you learn people. What he did was show us he had a telephone, and he could listen to British broadcasting, and he knew that Germany was in big trouble. And so I think he probably thought we could be insurance policy for him.
At this time, we knew that the war, that we were about to be overtaken. Prisoners were knocking the fences down, and the guards were still walking their beat. They weren't paying any attention to what prisoners might be doing. There was a group of prisoners that even tore a hole in the fence to where they could go downtown. Moosburg was only about a mile away, the city of Moosburg. They went downtown and tore down the German flag, signed their names to it. I believe that flag is on display somewhere in the world. On the 28th of April, 1945, we saw one of our artillery, Bill Elmer, we called him, artillery planes come over the camp.
And so we hung around there 2 days, and Tex was up in the bedroom they'd given us, and I heard him let out a gasp, and I said, "What's wrong, Tex?" And he says, "Take a look." We looked out the front door, and there was 4 German soldiers coming toward the front door. And the first thing I thought about doing was jumping out the window and running, and I think that'd be the most foolish thing we could do. And because I asked myself, what are German soldiers doing in a farmyard? As it turned out, they forced their way in. The Germans tried to stop them, but they came in anyway. So Tex and I just had to go downstairs and face them, and that wasn't easy. But as it turned out, it was really safe because I had my military rank on my collar. I was a first lieutenant at the time, and so was Tex. And I had my flight jacket on. And we told them real quickly, I said, we're ex-Kriegsgefangenen. And as it turned out, we were there several days with the German farmers and with the German soldiers. And we played cards and did a lot of things, got along pretty good. And strangely enough, they slept in the barn and we slept in the bedroom. Sounds strange. Sounds like fiction. It's not, but it isn't. It's true.
On the evening of, I believe, April 28th, a colonel came up the road of the German prison camp there at Moosburg, and with a white flag on a Jeep, and went into the commandant's office and supposedly make arrangements to take over the camp the next day.
One day we're sitting in the yard, they're just passing time away, and we see an L-liaison aircraft flying over. And I could see it was an American airplane.
P-51s shaking their wings, P-47s. We knew at this time that it wasn't going to be long.
And I told German farmer that I said, we have to check this out, see if that's an American aircraft, and if the Americans are anywhere nearby. And he okayed his French worker to make a trip down to an intersection about perhaps 3/4 of a mile away. And he came back in an hour or so with a staff sergeant, 2 staff sergeants and a Jeep, American staff sergeants. And boy, was that ever a thrill to Tex and I. We were just tickled to death to see these guys. And we let them know right away, don't be looting these people, leave them alone or befriend us. And it was a great feeling to see these staff sergeants.
The Liberation Day itself, you could have been hurt.
The guards had been instructed to remove and lay down their arms at 6 a.m. and to go into their own barracks. And they would become prisoners of the Allies. Someone from that barracks start the fire at that Jeep.
There was quite a bit of fire back and forth. The Allies were firing, and the Germans were, not the guards, but the infantry of what there was left of it was firing back and forth. So all the prisoners were laying on the ground, hoping not to be hit. But the battle was over. It lasted about 3 hours, and that was it.
The war was over on May 1st. The towers were empty on April 28th. The Germans had left. When the Russians showed up, they had 140 head of cattle. And we started barbecuing, and it didn't work. The food we ate came right back up.
The troops came in and started registering names and ranks of the prisoners, examining them from the standpoint of physical condition, and started to organize it.
And I recall trucks, Army trucks coming into the camp, and the prisoners were so happy that they would inundate the trucks, and the first Jeeps that came through, you couldn't hardly see the trucks or Jeeps, either one, for the guys that was landing on them, looking for a little extra food or what. They were just so happy to be liberated.
we went to the 14th Armored Division headquarters, which wasn't too far away, and that belonged to Patton's Third Army. And boy, did they treat us with open arms. Boy, it was a big thrill. And it was one of the big thrills of my life to see these Americans again that were POWs. Within a couple of days, we were just sitting around doing nothing, and this bunch of German POWs came by. They'd been captured by the Americans, and lo and behold, guess who was in front? The Stack Sergeant that stuck the pitchfork in our guy. And so I told this NCO I was talking to, I said, boy, that guy's a real rat. And he said, tell me about it. When I told Major the story, he says, well, Lieutenant, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We'll take him out in the field, and we'll have a court-martial, and we'll shoot him. And I said, oh, my God. Anyway, I didn't want it to happen because they're not supposed to do that to POWs.
After about 8 days of processing at this camp by our allies, Americans, we were trucked to a nearby airfield at Landshut, Germany. C-47s were waiting for us. We were flown to Le Havre, France for further processing.
I'm in France now at the Camp Lucky Strike. So I went out on hook the thumb of my ride to Le Havre. I get to Le Havre and they're loading boats with guys. So I went over to a man typing and I said, I'd like to get on this boat. And he said, you have to have orders. And I said, okay. So I saw a captain standing there. I went over to him and I said, sir, you got time for a war story? And I told him a war story, and he said, just a minute. He took me over to the same guys that cut this guy some orders, and they put me on the boat. I got to go home.
And then I got to see my crew members again, so they were all alive, and I was very happy about that.
I got home to my parents in June of that year, June 1945.
I'm the sole survivor. 9 guys were lost that day.
It was a pretty exciting adventure, no question about it. And all those years, or all those months, it's unbelievable. I did a book called Bulletproof, which turned out to be very successful because I was able to get in more detail on some of the aspects of the total operation. And that's about it, I guess.
So take care, and God bless you all.
You all